Hi. So, due to technical difficulties, I kind of just have to film this intro and tack it onto the actual video essay. But the topic that I'm going to be exploring is military propaganda, specifically the effects that it can have on democracy. I know that when we tend to think of propaganda, our minds usually jump to totalitarian regimes, but it's got its place in democracy too. And that's kind of what I'm going to want to go into, philosophy wise, but then also, bringing examples. So, I'm going to go into some reasons as to why it exists, some techniques that the government uses, and the potential effects that it can have on democratic culture. Enjoy! In his book, Reflections on the Revolution in France, Edmund Burke argues that the state needs to preserve a noble lie in order to maintain stability and national pride. He writes that all the pleasing illusions which made power gentle and obedience liberal, which harmonized the different shades of life, are to be dissolved by this new conquering empire of light and reason. All the decent drapery of life is to be rudely torn off. Here, Burke complains about the Enlightenment desire to expose truth because he believes that it can lead to chaos and destruction. He values the illusions of grandeur and nobility that are placed onto the noble and royal class because he believes that they bring a sense of peace and comfort. The masses must be convinced that the government is just and legitimate in order to preserve the world he values. This can be extrapolated to the modern United States. The goodness and nobility of the U.S. is sometimes an illusion that American citizens must be convinced of. Military propaganda is therefore a noble lie, and patriotism itself could be jeopardized if truth and reason prevail. However, Burke was writing in defense of the monarchy. So, are there any reasons that are specific to democratic government? Well, yeah. Propaganda might even be especially necessary in a democracy because it is the people who, indirectly, control the military. In Democracy in America, Alexis de Tocqueville reflects on the nature of armies in democratic nations. He argues that while democratic nations prefer peace because they've got rights, property, and ultimately, something to lose, democratic armies tend to have a thirst for war because the lack of rigid class structure makes lower-ranking soldiers much more ambitious. Because democratic citizens want peace and they, indirectly, control the military's budget, the army has incentive to convince citizens that war is warranted. This explanation of the prevalence of propaganda in democratic nations uses economic reasoning to explain a phenomenon that is specifically democratic. Propaganda, while it can erode or mask the truth, may be an inevitable symptom of democratic pluralism where competing interests fight for revenue. So, now the question remains, how does the government do this? How does propaganda work? Part 2. Techniques. There is a partnership between the mainstream media and the military that has been around for a long time. Racist media coverage of Japanese Americans during World War II helped to increase support for internment, an obvious violation of rights and a degradation of the quality of American democracy. This policy was enacted, ironically, in the name of preserving democracy and ending fascism globally, and therefore shows that a common American propaganda tactic is to portray a decrease in liberty as a necessary sacrifice to preserve it in the long run. But we'll get to that later. During the Vietnam War, the military and government would often feed the media lies and exaggerations about the strength of the North Vietnamese army and the state of the war in general. This was done in order to convince the general population that the war was being won, that it had a noble goal, and to calm widespread fear that the war would be a black hole of casualties. Here, the media was used to prop up faith that the American government was both good and competent. Media coverage was also often critical of the war, to be fair, but again, we'll get to that later. Similarly, during the first years of the Iraq War, media coverage was overwhelmingly supportive of the US, and some pundits were even fired for offering criticism of government policies. In Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman's 1988 book, Manufacturing Consent, they argue that there are 5 filters of the mainstream media that distort truth because of underlying self-interests. I want to focus on the third. There's a short animated summary of their argument that was produced by Al Jazeera, and they can articulate the concept better than I can, so here you go.
How does the establishment manage the media? That's the third filter. Governments, corporations, big institutions know how to play the media game. They know how to influence the news narrative. They feed media scoops, official accounts, interviews with the experts. They make themselves crucial to the process of journalism.
Media coverage, often working in tandem with broader government interests, can reduce the range of culturally acceptable positions to take, which, in my opinion, limits the public sphere and therefore the full potential of democracy, which isn't great. Another technique that the US government uses is a partnership with the Hollywood movie industry. Movies and visual media are an especially effective way to convince a group to adopt a set of specific beliefs. This is because the combination of editing, storytelling, cinematography, and realistic performances can elicit a very specific emotional response. Basically, it's easy for movies to manipulate your emotions and convince you of some message. During World War II, the US government produced and released films such as A Challenge to Democracy and Japanese Internment, which depicted life in internment camps as a positive experience overall.
Each family, upon arrival at a relocation center, was assigned to a single-room compartment, about 20 by 25 feet. Barren, unattractive. A stove, a light bulb, cots, mattresses, and blankets. Those were the things provided by the government.
However, these were not directly produced by Hollywood. The first instance of military funding in exchange for script involvement did not occur until Top Gun in 1986, and popular Hollywood blockbusters made with the assistance and oversight of the military blew up in the 2000s Iraq era. Directors such as Michael Bay would use military equipment in his films along with glorifying, cool, yet serious depictions of the military. While the use of military equipment is not a direct endorsement of military action, this article from The Guardian points out that military advisors will usually sign on to review the script and ensure that portrayal of the military is positive. This was the case in both Top Gun and Transformers: Revenge of the Fallen. When mainstream action-packed movies are financially incentivized to portray the Army in a positive light, you get an implicit political message thrown into fun, escapist entertainment. So, what are the side effects of propaganda? What are the implications for democracy and democratic culture? Do these pieces of media have serious effects? Part 3. The implication. It's important to examine the effects of a standing army, perpetual war, and the propaganda that goes with it can have on a nation. In The Human Condition, Hannah Arendt argues that speech and action are fundamental to human expression. She argues that action and speech are at their best when they come from a space of sheer human togetherness. When petty antagonism and team ideology are absent, humans can transcend their basic existence and achieve great and beautiful things that will be recognized through the company of others. However, when humans turn against each other, as, during a war, inspiring speeches and innovative actions become a means to an end and become hollow, devious replacements for actual expression. She argues that this occurs where men go into action and use means of violence in order to achieve certain objectives for their own side and against the enemy. In these instances, which of course have always existed, speech becomes indeed mere talk, simply one more means toward the end, whether it serves to deceive the enemy or to dazzle everybody with propaganda. Here, words reveal nothing. This dazzling yet ultimately meaningless propaganda that she mentions is still prevalent, used in everything from the Uncle Sam enlistment posters of World War I and World War II, to the freedom fries and never forget rhetoric of the Iraq era, and common Cold War era advertisements and posters against communism. Mary Wollstonecraft, in her book A Vindication of the Rights of Women, argues that even the presence of a standing army in a country encourages a culture of despotism. This is due to the strict hierarchical nature of an army, and the fact that soldiers are actively discouraged from thinking for themselves, instead being educated into blind obedience. She writes that a standing army, for instance, is incompatible with freedom because subordination and rigor are the very sinews of military discipline, and despotism is necessary to give vigor to the enterprises that one will directs. This appears paradoxical because, in the modern United States, the presence of a massive standing army is justified in the name of preserving liberty and democracy both domestically and globally. This sentiment of sacrificing liberty in order to save it feels very present in American war propaganda. The narrative surrounding World War II was largely one of fighting fascism and protecting democracy. Nowadays, things such as the military's Instagram and the enlistment advertisements that pop up on YouTube treat enlistment as a noble sacrifice. Soldiers give up their own freedom in order to preserve yours, and they therefore deserve respect. If you enlist, you could also be a noble soldier deserving of respect. Wollstonecraft's claim would therefore be very controversial today. Is it possible to sacrifice some liberty for the greater good? Or is any encroachment on freedom detrimental to democracy? While some sacrifices of liberty can be a productive way of ensuring that it remains protected, it can also cause a decrease in respect for individual rights and liberties. It is unclear whether or not Guantanamo Bay detention camp would have gained the bipartisan support it did if not for the nationalist response to 9/11. The Patriot Act allowed for mass government surveillance, and backers of the law capitalized off of the narrative that everything, even encroachment on freedom, was allowed in the name of preserving American democracy and security. Michael Moore's documentary, Fahrenheit 9/11, exposes this phenomenon. He shows the ways in which the government used propaganda, in partnership with the media, to stoke fear and justify the limitation of rights.
Fear works.
Fear does work, yes. You can make people do anything if they're afraid.
And how do you make them afraid?
Well, you make them afraid by creating an aura of endless threat. They played us like an organ. They raised the orange, and then up to red, and then they dropped it back to orange. I mean, they gave these mixed messages which were crazy-making.
Because of these things, the United States has become a nation that values privacy and due process less. Part 4. Backlash. However, not all propaganda campaigns are entirely successful. Backlash against the Iraq War started pretty quickly. As I just mentioned, Michael Moore's documentary came out in 2004, only 1 year after the invasion of Iraq. The country band the Dixie Chicks was outspoken in criticizing Bush and the Iraq War, and while there was lots of backlash against them, they also had plenty of support. The most famous and widespread example of backlash is probably the Vietnam War. Propaganda was countered with mass demonstrations, songs, public speeches, and works of art. These protests addressed class, imperialism, capitalism, and the sheer number of casualties in service of a vaguely unpopular, nearly unwinnable cause. The mainstream media also did not exclusively align themselves with government interests. Many outlets sent reporters to Vietnam in order to expose the hopelessness that was prevalent among soldiers and the destruction that was being done in the name of freedom.
DeValle is the lone medic in the platoon. He's scared from the moment he gets out of the chopper to the moment it picks him up. Scared that someday he's going to get killed picking up a wounded buddy.
Songs like War by Edwin Starr and Fortunate Son by Creedence Clearwater Revival, and also many others, reached immense popularity during the era, and some included a bit of Marxian class critique in there, you know. For example, Fortunate Son argues that some folks are born silver spoon in hand and, they're red, white, and blue. The band claims that those born in the upper class possess an out-of-touch nationalism that they themselves do not see the consequences of. Tocqueville actually agrees with this sentiment, arguing that democratic armies are generally led by proletarians, and that wealthier citizens rarely enlist. Basically, the poor die in the wars that the rich profit off of. Many young, working-class citizens rejected the government narrative that treated them as sacrifices in the name of global capitalism. Even without a mandatory draft, elements of class inequality persist in the Army. Nowadays, young men from mostly low-income backgrounds are enticed by promises of college scholarships and free quality healthcare that they would not have access to otherwise. Military advertisements prey on these men's lack of options. It is a large sacrifice, but one that may be their only way out of a cycle of poverty. However, even this escape path is not guaranteed. 40% of homeless men are veterans, and the suicide rate among veterans is twice that of the general population. The decision to enlist is therefore a risky one, and a combination of precarious circumstances and targeted propaganda are often needed to convince a young man to join. Part 5. Conclusion. Is backlash against propaganda a symbol of a nation's strength or fragility? Edmund Burke would argue that the US government's failure to preserve the grand illusions of nobility was a bad thing that threatened the legitimacy of the state. A writer like Wollstonecraft, on the other hand, would applaud the protesters for thinking for themselves. Protests may have helped end the Vietnam War, but it's unclear if they destabilized the government or delegitimized its conquests in the long run. The backlash against the Vietnam War may have encouraged the government to alter its course when it came to starting wars, or perhaps it just improved at covering its tracks. Today, most Americans see the Iraq War as an expensive lie that was told to them by the Bush administration, but mainstream criticism of the war in 2003 wasn't super prevalent. Many Americans are sick of war in the Middle East, yet there are over 60,000 soldiers stationed there as of January 2020. The fact that this hawkish foreign policy persists despite public approval could indicate that the democratic power that the masses are supposed to hold over their government is weak. Have the restrictions on liberty, such as the Patriot Act that propaganda justified, weakened democracy?